We are all too aware that the State of Israel has faced many challenges in its 63-year history, and in conventional warfare, Israel has prevailed at a great cost, but now the state faces a most insidious and dangerous form of attack, a battle that's fought on many fronts, and as Prime Minister Netanyahu mentioned in his speech at the UN on Friday, the world around Israel is becoming more dangerous, and it's not the policies of Israel that are opposed, but the very existence of Israel. And Israel is faced with increasing challenges, not the least of which the issues that were raised this past week at the United Nations. And there is the uncertainty as a result of the changes in the Middle East, the so-called Arab Spring, question of relations with Egypt, with Turkey, and the serious threat of a nuclear Iran. And perhaps equally serious as the aforementioned is the criticism that exhibits blatant double standard, singles out Israel, denies its right to exist, and demonizes the state. That is defined as the delegitimization of Israel. It includes a campaign calling for boycott, divestment, and sanctions known as the BDS movement, an economic, cultural, and academic boycott of Israel initiated in 2002. The idea was introduced at the first United Nations-sponsored World Conference on Racism in Durban. The idea was to use the very tactics used to isolate South Africa's apartheid regime and apply it to Israel. Delegitimization includes anti-Israel demonstrations on campuses, protests when Israeli athletes compete abroad, and threats of arrest warrants for Israeli political and military leaders when they travel to Europe by applying the laws of universal jurisdiction. The latter constitutes lawfare, which includes the exploitation of courts in democratic countries to harass Israelis with accusations of war crimes or crimes against humanity, as well as other charges. Criticism of Israel often stretches beyond legitimate discourse regarding the policies, but challenges its very right to exist, the right of self-determination of the Jewish people. The ramifications of delegitimization are global and affect not only Israel, but Jews around the world. So we must be informed and ready to challenge the delegitimizers. The question is asked, is delegitimization the modern form of anti-Semitism? We are here this morning to face the hard realities, addressing delegitimization and anti-Semitism. We are fortunate to have this morning 3 illustrious speakers to address this topic. A question and answer session will take place following the presentation by the 3 speakers. Our first speaker is Daniel Mariaschin, who serves as the Executive Vice President of B'nai B'rith International. As the organization's top executive officer, he directs and supervises B'nai B'rith programs, activities, and staff in more than 50 countries where B'nai B'rith is organized. And he serves as director of the B'nai B'rith Center for Human Rights and Public Policy and coordinates the center's programs and policies on issues of concern to the Jewish community. In the United States abroad, Mr. Mariaschin has met with countless heads of state, and he has helped to protect the rights of Jewish communities worldwide and promote better relations with the State of Israel. He has been a member of many influential delegations. He participated as part of the US delegation to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, which was a conference on anti-Semitism, took place in Vienna, and he has been recognized for his tireless work by many countries around the world. He has written numerous articles and reviews on foreign affairs and national security issues for many prominent publications, and he has lectured on foreign and defense affairs at the U.S. Department's Foreign Service Institute. It is my distinct pleasure and privilege to introduce and to bring forth Mr. Daniel Mariaschin.
Thank you, Jan. Perhaps the most important thing on the CV was left out. I was the director of the Boston office of the American Zionist Federation, which was the predecessor organization of the AZM in the mid-1970s. I want to thank Bill and Karen for the invitation, and I want to thank them for their tireless work on behalf of the Zionist movement, on behalf of the State of Israel. I've seen it up close for many, many years, and we deeply appreciate it. It's also a privilege to be on a panel with Ken Stein and Brooke Goldstein. Ken, whom I've known for many years, is an eminent historian and one of the most important interpreters of the Zionist experience. And Brooke Goldstein heads an organization which addresses, Jan has just pointed out, the lawfare issue, one of the most pernicious challenges of our time, and has taken this issue and taught all of us not only about the issue itself, but what we can do about it. Well, we have come through the last few days, the opening of the UN General Assembly, and we're reminded by some of the speeches at the General Assembly, some of the speeches at the 10th anniversary of the Durban process, which was a few days ago, also at the UN, reminded again about the slippery slope, not so slippery anymore, between delegitimization and demonization and anti-Semitism. Since the outbreak of the Second Intifada in October of 2000, anti-Semitism has spiked around the globe. It has once again become one of the great social ills in, of all places, Europe, the Middle East, and elsewhere. The most frequent contemporary manifestation of anti-Semitism is, as Janice pointed out in her introduction, anti-Israel hatred. However commonplace criticism of Israel has become, it has in many places crossed the line, often blurring itself into a new and viral form of anti-Semitism. The demonization and delegitimization of Israel has become a daily occurrence, not just from the margins. And many of you will remember when 20 or 25 years ago we would work on issues brought to us by Congressman Paul Finley and Congressman Pete McCloskey, and a little bit later there was Pat Buchanan, and the early anti-Zionism and demonization of Israel that came from the margins was, we thought, a major challenge to us. It was. Except that in the past 10 to 15 years, over the past generation, this process has moved from the margins to the center. And people like Professors Mearsheimer and Walt, who speak and write of the ills of the Israel lobby, I'm sure Ken Stein will speak about this later. Former President Carter, whose book, Palestine, Peace or Apartheid, includes the charge that Israel is the greatest human rights abuser in the world. Comments that were made just a couple of days ago, yesterday morning, on Global Public Square by Turkey's Prime Minister Erdogan, in which he said that, and I quote, "We know that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians have been killed by Israel. Only in Gaza," he said, "we know of thousands." And he wasn't challenged by Zakaria. He wasn't challenged. And so now it becomes part of the public record. And it'll be on Google. And if you Google Erdogan, you'll find out that he's charging Israelis with having killed hundreds of thousands of Palestinians. Falsehoods about Israel are repeated so often that they become widely accepted in the popular culture and sometimes impact government policy. And Mahmoud Abbas, on Friday, repeated, notwithstanding whatever position one might come from in terms of the peace process, because we're not talking about the peace process necessarily here, we're talking about the language associated with the peace process and how it affects us as Jews and as Zionists. And so Abbas on Friday created his own blood libel. He contributed language to the history of blood libels against the Jewish people when he charged Israelis with ethnic cleansing and racial discrimination. He said there is a, quote, multi-pronged policy of ethnic cleansing carried out by the Israelis, and that Israelis have deported elected representatives from Jerusalem. The language, deportations, ethnic cleansing, the same kind of language that's used when we describe the Nazi regime. And then he fanned the flames a little bit more. He said later in his speech, and I quote, "In addition, now we face the imposition of new situation, not previously raised conditions, that will transform the raging conflict in our already inflamed region into a religious conflict." The threats, he said, to the future of 1.5 million Christian and Muslim Palestinians living in Israel is, in his view, also a great crime. Now, the United Nations Zionism is Racism Resolution 1975, the Durban 1 meeting 2001, the Durban 2 Review Conference in 2009, the Durban 3 conference a couple of days ago, and the Goldstone report of 2 years ago have been used by the international community to taint the Jewish state and undermine its right to exist. Hamas and other Arab groups quote the protocols of the Elders of Zion to accuse Jews of controlling U.S. foreign policy and plotting to take over the Middle East, as well as blaming the Jews for the current global economic crisis. In fact, in one iteration, actually, of the Hamas covenant, you can find under the category of supporters of Zionism, my own organization, and I think Rotary International. Now, you have to figure that one out, but I think this is the iteration that's on, I think, the Truman Center's website from Hebrew University. But constant use, constant reference to the protocols of the Elders of Zion proves that that publication, that canard, more than 100 years old, is still with us and being practiced right now in the Middle East. Holocaust deniers attempt to undercut the need for Israel's existence by minimizing the Nazi genocide against the Jews, and it was done again this week for the umpteenth time by Iran's President Ahmadinejad. And our worry is on Holocaust denial is that we're now getting, unfortunately, to the end of the biological clock. We're reaching that period where there will be no more survivors with tattoos on their arms to say that they experienced it, that they lived it, that they saw it, that they were witnesses. Holocaust denial is not something, again, which is now, which was at the margins at one time. It's now being carried out in the mainstream, or at least the politically correct and accepted mainstream, by not only Ahmadinejad, but many others. And notwithstanding the peace process off and on, the Palestinian Authority media and textbooks continue to refute the Jewish connection to the land of Israel and claim that the Jews are not a people and therefore not entitled to a country of their own, which gets to the issue of recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. And I just saw this morning, and I have to check the reference, but I see the government of Spain said something this morning about recognizing Israel as a Jewish state. It's interesting because Spain recognized Israel 25 years ago, but now they've come out with the Jewish state recognition. The deliberate delegitimization of the Jewish state leads to the gradual erosion of Israel's stature and ultimately its right to exist. And once Israel is branded as racist, it becomes easier to portray it as a country that harms civilian populations, oppresses minorities, and enacts restrictive immigration laws and religious statutes as part of a racist ideological program. All of Israel's military and legal actions are then cast as racist. And slanders against Israel are calculated to intensify its isolation in the international community, which in turn gravely weakens its national security. Now, Natan Sharansky identified a 3D test for differentiating legitimate criticism of Israel from anti-Semitism: demonization, delegitimization, and double standards. With its 2003 Vienna Conference, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE, began a process still underway of securing commitments from the 56 member states in North America, Europe, and the former Soviet Union to condemn anti-Semitism and to develop and implement practical tools to combat it. It's not easy. At the OSCE's historic 2004 Berlin Conference, then Secretary of State Colin Powell told the gathering, and I believe this was the first time that any international leader said the following: "It is not anti-Semitic to criticize the state of Israel, but the line is crossed when Israel or its leaders are demonized or vilified, for example, by the use of Nazi symbols and racist caricatures." The OSCE's landmark 2004 Berlin Declaration stated, quote, unambiguously that international developments or political issues, including those in Israel or elsewhere in the Middle East, never justify anti-Semitism. In 2005, the European Union Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia adopted a working definition of anti-Semitism, that the ways in which anti-Israel rhetoric crossed the line into anti-Semitism include: 1, denying the Jewish people their right to self-determination, that is, by claiming that the existence of a state of Israel is a racist endeavor. 2, applying double standards by requiring of it a behavior not expected or demanded by any other democratic nation. 3, using the symbols and images associated with classic anti-Semitism, for example, claims of Jews killing Jesus or blood libel, to characterize Israel or Israelis. 4, drawing comparisons of contemporary Israeli policy to that of the Nazis. And 5, holding Jews collectively responsible for actions of the State of Israel. Now, both the OSCE Berlin Declaration and the EUMC working definition of anti-Semitism should be disseminated as widely as possible to educate public officials and educators, journalists and others about the current manifestations of anti-Semitism. You know, now we're getting into the fall, but in the winter there'll be probably another spate of cartoons. We've already seen a few cartoons. Some of you may have seen a few already that have come out of the last few days of the Palestinian initiative for statehood. One of my favorite cartoons appeared several years ago in La Stampa, which is an otherwise respected Italian newspaper, and it came around Christmas time. A lot of these cartoons are in the paper using, in the newspapers using Christmas imagery. And you may remember this one. This was of a creche with a baby in the creche, suggesting the baby Jesus, but meaning in this particular case the Palestinians. An Israeli soldier standing over the creche with a gun, and the caption, supposedly coming from the baby, was, "Oh no, not again." So here you have, in a mainstream newspaper, otherwise respectable, a cartoon, I'm sure defended by the editors of La Stampa. I didn't engage in a debate with them, but I'm sure that they would say that this is all about freedom of speech. Once again, resurrecting the charge of deicide, comparing Israeli treatment of Palestinians to the murder of Jesus, done twice by Jews, according to the editorial cartoonist in La Stampa. Every day brings new examples. I mentioned yesterday's appearance by Erdogan on Fareed Zakaria's program, Unchallenged by Zakaria again, suggesting that hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had been killed by Israelis. But every day brings new examples. A committee within the Presbyterian Church USA reopened controversy this month by recommending that the church divest from 3 companies doing business with Israel. The church's Committee on Mission Responsibility through Investment released a report on September 9th advising that the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church divest from Motorola, Hewlett-Packard, and Caterpillar. Be sure to buy their products or support them if you can. In Venezuela, where the regime consistently vilifies Israel in the harshest possible terms, broadcaster Cristina Gonzalez of the state-owned national radio openly encouraged listeners earlier this year to read the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. And then on the 17th of this month, in a letter to Ban Ki-moon, and I'm going to read it from my BlackBerry. This is the limit of my high-tech capability, but I thought I would read it from here because it's important. This was just a few days ago. So, Hugo Chavez, the dictator in Venezuela, says, and I quote, "It is upsetting and painful that the same people who suffered one of the worst examples of genocide in history have become the executioners of the Palestinian people. It is upsetting and painful that the heritage of the Holocaust be the Nakba. And it is truly disturbing that Zionism continues to use the charge of anti-Semitism as blackmail against those who oppose their violations and crimes. Israel has blatantly and despicably used and continues to use the memory of the victims of the Holocaust. And they do so, and they act with complete impunity against Palestine." He says, then it's worth mentioning that anti-Semitism is a Western European scourge in which the Arabs do not participate. Furthermore, let's not forget that it is the Semitic Palestinian people who suffer from the ethnic cleansing practiced by the Israeli colonialist state. Chavez is another one who constantly uses the word genocide. And what they've done, what the Europeans do engage in this, those in the Middle East do, what Chavez does, is they have, and you heard this right here in this little twist on the victims of the Holocaust. And basically what they're saying is, you say you were victims. You say you were the victims between 1933 and 1945, but now you are the victimizer. You're the victimizer. It isn't even an apartheid state charge that they're making. The charge is that Israelis are Nazis, that Zionists are Nazis. The turning of the tables, and is reprehensible, but what's even more reprehensible than that, because we know from whence this comes, but what's more reprehensible is that there's no pushback. It isn't even a matter of being politically correct. It's a matter of don't confuse me with the facts. It's a matter of hearing something so abhorrent and hearing it so many times that it simply falls off like water off a duck's back. There's no pushback. Prime Minister Erdogan, whom I mentioned earlier, took the podium at the UN just a few days ago and vociferously condemned Israel again before the General Assembly. Earlier this month, he rejected the findings of the Palmer Commission from the UN that had declared Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip to be legal. Erdogan revealed plans, you know this, you've read it, to take Israel to the International Criminal Court to pursue legal action for last year's Gaza flotilla operation. And you saw what happened in London just a few weeks ago. The Israel Philharmonic Orchestra went to Royal Albert Hall, was interrupted several times. Finally, the program was so disrupted that BBC, no great friend of Israel, just unplugged the concert altogether. 4 musicians in the London Philharmonic Orchestra advocated canceling the event. You know, cultural boycotts, there's another area. Jan mentioned academic boycotts. Cultural boycotts are another area. Just in the past 12 or 14 months, a number of important entertainers have, in a very public way, canceled their performances in Israel. One was Elvis Costello, Gil Scott-Heron, the Pixies and the Gorillas. Now, I honestly, I had to go to Google. But apparently they're popular among some people. You know why it's important? You know why I mention the Pixies and the Gorillas? And I don't mean to be facetious. I mention it because they tweet their fans, and their fans tweet them, and they go to Facebook. And so the Pixies and the Gorillas say on their Facebook page that they've just canceled a performance in Israel because of the treatment of Palestinians. And it goes viral because all the fans all tweet each other to repeat the message over and over again. And we take our hats off to some performers who actually went ahead and performed, and I give them a lot of credit. Elton John was among them. Diana Krall, who happens to be married to Elvis Costello. You can imagine what that's like in that family. But the point is clear. These are folks, and here I'm being serious. I would bet that if we had the Pixies and the Gorillas right now on stage and we put a map of the world on this screen, that they would be hard-pressed to tell us where the state of Israel is. And that's the problem. You all saw a group of, it wasn't a group, it was a mob of Egyptian protesters this month who set out to tear down the wall that had been built by the Egyptian police to protect the Israeli embassy in Cairo. Well, the police were watching, didn't do anything about it. With hammers and broken poles, they struck down most of the barrier while burning Israeli flags and a nearby security kiosk. Then they broke into the embassy. The point here is, this goes now into the area of the peace process, but there's a message here for the demonizers and the delegitimizers that they're back. And there have been all kinds of analyses as to why they're back. But this kind of activity that we saw in Egypt is only used to buttress those who engage in demonization and delegitimization. And finally, the global movement to boycott, divest, and sanction Israel, Jan mentioned, BDS, began in 2005, has seen all kinds of manifestations. It's not just, it's in places that you wouldn't even imagine. Several regions of Scotland have approved bans on books and other goods originating in Israel. After legal advisors instructed the mayor of Dundee to refrain from legally enforcing the boycott, the municipality now plans instead to place a special mark on Israeli products and to distribute posters throughout the city calling on residents not to buy the marked goods. And this kind of activity is being repeated in other places as well. Well, that's the problem. What do we do about it? We do about it with the kinds of things that Brooke does with Lawfare, other organizations. What Jewish organizations have done this week, we have taken these issues directly to the top diplomats of, in our case, B'nai B'rith is part of a consortium of 5 Jewish organizations that last week, and we will Monday and Tuesday as well, meet with foreign ministers, prime ministers, presidents of countries who have come to New York for the opening of the UN General Assembly to take these issues and to discuss them. Because this is global in scope, dozens of countries are affected. And so we have to, those Jewish organizations that have international branches and chapters, offices, have to be brought into this effort as well. I mentioned the efforts, strenuous efforts with public diplomacy, meeting diplomats. You know, we're lucky today in a way. We didn't necessarily have this opportunity 20 or 25 years ago. But today, there is more interaction between Jewish organizations and diplomats in various contexts, and it's important for us to beef up those efforts. A wide array of Jewish NGOs need to coordinate and work together. Conference of Presidents, major American Jewish organizations, is doing that. It's the important umbrella for this kind of activity. You'll hear later from Malcolm Hohenlein, and he'll tell you more about what the conference is doing. Individuals. You know, a lot of people say, well, what can I do? Well, you can do a lot. Today, take a look at comment. You can comment on anybody's blog. You can have your say. You know, it used to be we'd say, write a letter to the editor. Send a, you know, I even go back to the days of telegram banks. So you can respond. And if you're opening your computer every day, as I'm sure you do, take a look at some of the egregious places and not so egregious, mainstream places where terrible stuff appears. I think there's one other issue that I suppose may be somewhat controversial, although I don't mean it to be controversial. I'm finishing up. I don't mean it to be controversial, but I'll finish here. I attended a meeting in 1979 at the Conference of Presidents. I was working here in New York for the Anti-Defamation League, and the speaker was Senator Fritz Hollings of South Carolina, and he was considering a run for the presidency. He didn't run for the presidency ultimately, but I think he was out there trying to make a little noise for himself. So he visited Israel, and he came back, he spoke to the conference. And at that time, there was a vote on the F-15s. Remember the F-15 fighter jets to Saudi Arabia? And Hollings voted for. And somebody asked him in the audience, you know, it was a nice speech. He gave a speech and said all the right things. But somebody said, well, how come you voted for the F-15s? And Hollings said, and I won't imitate his drawl, but he said, well, because my good friend Abe Ribicoff voted for it. What we do and what we say, and this is not to impose any kind of discipline on a particular point of view, but what we do and what we say as Jews, as Zionists, as members of Jewish organizations, has consequences. And I think as we deal with these issues, we need to be mindful of that. Again, Bill, Karen, thank you very much for the opportunity to join you. Thank you.